Colin, can you hear us? So let's just start. So aloha and good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for being here this Wednesday evening. Quick introduction about myself. I am Vinod Vidu, moderator of this panel session. I work as a Director of Strategic Initiatives with Oceanet. Today, we have an amazing panel on global energy transformation, decarbonizing the world's energy system, where we'll try to explore different sides of the energy transformation efforts that's occurring around all of us. Quick background on the panel theme. As we all know, the climate change costs and impacts are driving a mandate for energy transformation away from the energy sources as we know, the fossil energy that creates climate impacts towards a greener energy. Less climate impactful energy. Principally, these are, as we all clearly know, are driven by solar, wind, geothermal, or other non-fossil fuel sources. At the same time, we all understand that this industries, the energy industries as a whole, is pretty complicated and massive. Transforming is not only a technical issue, it's a major geopolitical challenge that sort of encompasses everything that is in the what we call TCOP, technical, economical, commercial, organizational, and political. So to make things matter worse, the massive installed infrastructure that is already in place that enables the world to operate on fossil energy has similar legacy and ownership issues, including the major energy supply chains, the upstream exploration, production, transmission, refining, and distribution, everything included. So when we look for change, all of this must change or adapt for the world to transform from fossil to non-fossil sources of energy, including, then that's where the challenge comes in, I think, including government policies, national energy companies, and international energy companies to the new world order. So how do we accommodate these massive forces to enable science, engineering, and technology to intercede and save our planet? So to discuss and explore some direction or to build on their expertise, we have three great panelists today with decades of experience in policy, major global industry operations, and decarbonization initiatives. So to give you a structure for the panel, so here's the format that you should expect. Each of the panelists will first share their high-level thoughts and remarks. I think each of the panelists will be roughly take 10 minutes. After that, I would like to ask the panelists a couple of questions as panel questions, and we'll open up for panel discussion and eventually open for public questions. So as first step, let me introduce Elena Melkert. Elena Melkert is a 36 years of experience veteran of the energy industry, recently retiring as Director, Upstream Oil and Gas Research Division at the U.S. Department of Energy. Her over 3 decades of experience at US DOE includes managing a range of energy programs, including numerous policy, technology, and research partnerships with industry, academia, federal and state agencies, and NGOs. So with that introduction, I hand over to Elena. Please go ahead.
Hello, thank you. I'm very honored to be here today. I'll go ahead and launch my slide deck. There we go.
Yeah, we can see it.
Very good. Okay. So thank you, Dina. I am Elena Subia Melkert, and I've actually been in the oil business for 40 years. I served 36 of those years with the Department of Energy. I worked in the oil fields operations, field operations for 8 years, both in the private sector and for the Department of Energy at a giant oil field outside of Bakersfield that was owned by the government. Another policy technology interface type of situation. It was a commercial oil field that the government owned in partnership with Chevron. And I was a production engineer, and then a reservoir engineer before I came to Washington to manage that oil field, as well as then go into the research program. But my whole career has been, most of my career has been at that policy technology interface. So let me go ahead and launch these slides. So Vinod asked me to talk about my experience and the fact that I've served 7 presidents here in Washington, D.C. in my career for the Department of Energy. And so he asked me to talk about some of the, the lessons learned associated with what I've seen over the course of this time. And so what I've learned is that change is defined by the starting point, that it takes time and other resources, especially money, that you need tools, and that there's a process for ensuring the change that you want. So these few slides, 2 slides, are sort of a timeline of recent energy-related challenges, if you will. And there are some personal overtones associated with this timeline. So my first experience with the geopolitical challenges referenced by Dr. Jurgen is that under the Nixon administration, OPEC held an oil embargo that caused the United States, all of us in the United States, to stand in gasoline lines because gasoline was rationed because there was concern that we wouldn't have enough. So the the government established a rationing program that caused people to get into lines, and you could only get gas every other day. I was 19, and it was difficult trying to get to school and work with respect to having the resources that we needed. So this oil embargo of 1973 led President Ford to set an energy policy goal for the U.S. to reduce dependence on foreign oil. So as you'll see later, it took 40 years for us to end our dependence on foreign oil and our dependence on OPEC. In 1977, President Carter established the U.S. Department of Energy, and that included the national laboratories, and that was an energy policy tactic for reducing our dependence on foreign oil. DOE is a science and technology organization, so this established the policy technology interface that we referenced earlier. I started my career in 1981 with in Bakersfield, California, working the field operations with Getty Oil that was later acquired by Chevron. And then in 1985, I worked in field operations for DOE at the Elk Hills Naval Petroleum Reserve, a giant commercial oil field owned at that time by the federal government in partnership with Chevron. Government owned 80%, Chevron owned 20%, operated as a unit, commercial operations. In January 1990, my husband and I moved from Bakersfield to Washington, D.C. for me to work at the DOE headquarters, overseeing Elk Hills, and then later I joined the oil and gas research team. A year later, at the start of Operation Desert Storm, which was the United States and allies trying to get Iraq out of Kuwait, on January 16th, I was in the hospital just having given birth to our only child. And during my recovery, I couldn't help but pray for all the pregnant women caught in the middle of that conflict. So energy policy and energy needs around the world really affect our lives in sometimes dramatic ways. So a few months before September 11th, I worked at the White House for the Bush-Cheney Energy Task Force, supporting their development of the National Energy Strategy. And up to that time, we had not had a national energy strategy. In 2015, under President Obama, Congress lifted the ban on U.S. oil exports. And this was due in large part to the U.S. supply of oil and gas resulting from the shale revolution. Again, the energy policy goal set by President Ford in response to the oil embargo of 1973 was met 40 years later due to new technology capabilities that resulted in massive shale development. In 2019, under President Trump, the U.S. became the world's top oil and gas producer, making it clear that OPEC no longer had a hold over the United States. So now in 2021, President Biden has set an energy policy goal related to climate change to decarbonize U.S. power sector by 2035, which is about 15 years, and to achieve a net zero carbon economy by 2050, about 30 years. So to put a finer point on this energy policy goal, I want to turn to the Energy Information Administration. EIA is an independent federal agency of the Department of Energy, and each January, EIA publishes the annual energy outlook that forecasts future energy supply and demand. Obviously, the Energy Information Administration published this year's annual energy outlook before inauguration. So let me point out that EIA models current policies in place, and so it's policy neutral. And the oil price used in this analysis was $95 per barrel in for 2050. So the next 5 slides are taken from the 2021 AEO, which forecasts energy supply and demand out to 2050. And this period coincides with the president's energy policy goals. So I'd like to quickly make a few points about each. So this slide shows energy demand with actual data for up to 2020, and then forecasted numbers up to 2050. The model forecasts that U.S. consumers will use more energy going forward than ever before, mostly for power generation and in the industrial sector. This slide shows that even though energy demand is increasing, we are using that energy more efficiently. So this curve is going down to 2050. So here is a forecast regarding consumption by fuel, and the consumption profile is probably pretty familiar. It's comparable to what we have now with oil and gas dominating the consumption, but you'll note had a dramatic increase in consumption of renewable energy. This slide shows that oil will be used primarily for transportation and by the industrial sector. In the industrial sector, oil and gas are both used as a fuel and as a feedstock. And that natural gas is used primarily for power generation. I just realized that this is the wrong slide. Okay, so normally this, if my correction had been complete, this graphic over here would show natural gas, not petroleum, and it would show that natural gas was used primarily for power generation. Okay, this slide shows that U.S. production of oil and gas will continue, making it possible for the U.S. to possibly continue exporting oil and gas. So that's what I call the starting point. You've got to know where you are and contrast to where you want to be. So looking at some insights about change, change takes time, you need tools, and it's a process. So I'd like to move into comments about that a little bit. In January, President Biden ordered that the U.S. rejoin the Paris Agreement. And on August 31st, the parties will meet in Glasgow for COP26, Conference of the Parties, COP. Earlier this month, the Environmental Protection Agency released its draft strategy to protect human health and the environment. It has 7 goals and 17 objectives and 4 strategies. And the first goal is to tackle the climate crisis. This slide captures some of the goals and actions that the administration and Congress and others are pursuing. So as far as goals go, the administration's goal is decarbonization and net zero carbon economy. Congress still has to pass a budget for fiscal year 2021, and the infrastructure bill is still pending. With respect to action items, actions pending, actions being pursued, Congress is still working on funding The administration has actually taken some steps with respect to the oil and gas sector and coal sector. The Office of Fossil Energy was renamed the Office of Fossil Energy and Carbon Management, and the name change reflects a new focus in terms of working on research, development, and demonstration for carbon capture, utilization, and storage, for the affordable production, transport, storage, and use of hydrogen across different sectors of the economy, for direct air capture of carbon, and for decarbonizing high carbon industries such as cement and steel. And the industry has recently announced an agreement to engage in dialogue to support large-scale development of carbon capture storage technologies, all in the Houston area. So the next thought is, when it comes to motivating change, there are two very important tools, policy and technology. So when do you use policy to push change, and when do you use markets to pull change? So the answer is it depends. Policy can push. It has strengths and weaknesses. Markets can pull. They also have strengths and weaknesses. And I guess that's the bottom line, that there is no easy answer. There's no obvious answer. It's a case-by-case basis. And you want to be sure to understand any unintended consequences by anything that you pursue. For example, regulations can push markets to act, but enforcement is expensive. And then with respect to market pull, unless you really understand the market dynamics, you may be providing a solution that nobody really wants. So there's no easy way to pursue change. Goals that need, when it comes to executing change, you need to get organized and have everyone moving in the same direction. Plus you need one more important thing. You need leadership, because lasting change takes time, money, attentiveness, and commitment. I'm Elena Subio-Melker, and it's been my honor to talk with you today. Back to you, Vina.
Thank you very much, Elena, for giving that background and insights over the last 35 plus years of your experience dealing with policy matters when it comes to energy. I have a few questions on that one, but I'll revisit later on in the panel discussion. Let me just introduce the next panelist, Hani Elshahawi. Hani is a 33-year veteran of the energy industry, spending about 18 years at Shell, one of the major oil companies, with responsibilities that included digitalization of Deepwater assets. He was pivotal in the Shell GameChanger program in developing disruptive technology, technology advisor and capability manager, and leader of Shell's Fluid Evaluation and Sampling Technology Center of Excellence. Prior to joining Shell, Hani also spent about 15 years at one of the largest service companies, Schlumberger, and he served in different countries, Africa, Asia, North America, and globally spanning operations in all kinds of capabilities in marketing, consulting, and technology development. Hani, actually in 2022, he's going to be the chair of the Offshore Technology Conference in Houston, arguably the largest energy conference in the world. And he is also the founder and managing director of Novi Digitech, LLC, which partners with innovators, academics, startups, and entrepreneurs, investors, and customers to create impact and drive growth through integration, collaboration, and digitalization and education. He is a prolific, in the area of energy, publishing, I think, roughly about 150 technical publications and several patents. With that, I would like Hani to share his thoughts on what it takes or his perspectives about the energy transformation, looking from his experience in the big energy industry. Please go ahead, Hani. You are on mute.
Yeah, aloha everyone, and thank you very much, Vinod, for the kind introduction and for the opportunity. I hope my connection keeps up. It's been a little bit iffy here, but let me go ahead and share my screen, if you don't mind. Hopefully you can see my screen okay?
Yes, Hani.
All right.
Coming through well.
Okay, well, what I was going to talk about here a little bit is sort of beyond net zero and talk a little bit about how Hawaii might show the world really a good example of not just how we can lead in the energy transition in net zero transition, but in sustainability as a whole. So first, a little bit of context setting. As it is now, fossil fuels remain the primary source of energy in the world. About roughly 84% comes from the combination of oil, gas, and coal, as you can see in this plot here, with the rest made up by nuclear, about 4%, and then the rest from renewables, including hydropower, wind, and all that. So in order to wean off of fossil fuels altogether, it will take quite a while. There's a lot of energy, to use the term, that is being put into actually weaning off from fossil fuels. And that there's no doubt that will eventually happen, but it will take, in most scenarios and most opinions, decades, and it will take also significant investment, and not without some pain. Again, to put things in perspective, in 2000, the percentage of the energy coming from fossil fuels was 86%. So actually, the change from the last 20 some years is a mere 2%, despite all the investments in wind and solar in particular. But to also put things in context, the energy industry as a whole, and if you really include the actual energy use in the industry, as well as used in transport, as well as the use in buildings, if you aggregate all that and also include combustion, fugitive emissions, and all of that, then it's arguably responsible for about 3/4 of the emissions. So the energy sector as a whole and its aggregate usage downstream of it is indeed responsible for major part of the emissions. So that has to be addressed. If we look forward to the future, then, and we'll talk a little bit what future are we talking about here? What kind of time frame? There is no doubt that electricity demand will rise overall in almost any scenario that you can imagine, and it's very logical to expect that a lot of that will be provided by photovoltaic and wind. For example, already as of 2021, in just the last decade alone, the cost of photovoltaic has already fallen by more than 70%, and quite similar numbers to wind as well over that same time frame. So if we fast forward, it is very feasible to expect it to fall further. And hence, by 2025, we expect photovoltaic and wind to become competitive with natural gas power generation in most parts of the world. And in most scenarios out there, the overall, I think Elena already pointed out to a few, the overall demand for energy would increase. In some of them, it would stabilize or maybe slightly fall back. But in general, if you expect that the world will continue to lift people out of poverty, and to demand more electricity for connectivity or what have you, the overall demand for energy would increase with time. However, there's still about a third of the world's inhabitants that still does not have access to electricity today. So there's a great part of the world that still has to be electrified, if that is a feasible route to get energy to them. Now, with all the scenarios out there, there's really no credible scenario out there in which hydrocarbons disappear completely by mid-century. There's a lot of commitments made by countries, made by companies, by corporations, to go to net zero by mid of the century. However, there's really no credible scenario in which the hydrocarbons will disappear altogether. It's just not feasible. So they will remain important in just about any scenario out there as the world adapts to support that net zero future. And just to add some detail to that, I show here some scenarios which were developed by Shell, published in February of this year as part of the Shell Strategy Day. So this is publicly available data. And in it, they talk about three scenarios, three sort of bookend type scenarios, which they call waves, islands, and sky scenario. Essentially, the sky scenario is an accelerated scenario which prioritizes health and the environment over all else. The wealth first scenario is late but fast, and then somewhere in between is a security first scenario, which also balances the two, and it's you achieve 2.5 C. So it's a late but slow, so it's sort of in between. And if you look then in the sky scenario, which is really the most aggressive of the lot, you can see out to 2100, there is a significant electricity consumption growth, predominantly coming from renewables. That's shown in the light yellow here, the navy blue, and that replaces the darker blue, which is essentially fossil fuel generation of electricity, so that almost diminishes. And then on the reddish colors, you've got liquid fuels, because the world will still need, of course, liquid fuels for a variety of chemicals and other hard to electrify sectors. And those also will start to become predominantly non-fossil fuel based. And then you've got the gaseous fuels, which was also shift from fossil to non-fossil. However, fossil fuels don't disappear altogether, even out to 2100. Maybe to add a little bit more color to this scenarios, you can see here, the 1.5 C scenario, which is a sky scenario, which is where we aspire to be, and then you've got the waves in between, and the 2.5 C, which is insufficient to reach the Paris goals. And then plotted on this here, a lot of things have to come together. So net zero CO2 emissions have to be reached, but also at the same time, electrification of vehicles has to reach very substantial fractions. Now remember, maybe in 10, 20 years, all new vehicles will be electric, but you still got a large fleet that is existing, which has to be incrementally replaced or decommissioned. And then electrification has to penetrate other sectors of the economy. Deforestation has to come in and play its part, and so on and so forth. So if you really look at all those scenarios, we need all of those solutions to play their part. You name it, hydrogen and so on. But even then, if you look carefully here, and basically the whitish part is somewhere between 2100 and beyond. That's the light colored here. Even then, oil use would fall below 1970 levels, and Elena already talked about that. So even out there, in most scenarios, we still need fossil fuels for a long time to come. So how, I thought it would be interesting to talk about how an integrated energy company such as Shell And Shell and most of the European majors are quite progressive in their approach to net zero, both in terms of commitment, but also in terms of reimagining their business. How might then their business models change? Because ultimately, if you want to stay relevant in that world, you have to rethink what it is that you provide. So you can see again from the Shell Strategy Day how the critical business drivers factor in the different pillars that they build. So for example, for Shell, they defined a growth pillar, which is essentially the future of energy as far as they're concerned, a transition pillar, which enables that, and then an upstream pillar, which essentially bankrolls or finances that. So this is kind of your existing business, and this is kind of your future business. And if you look, it's a transition. It's basically a smooth transition from one to the other, because you cannot afford to completely cut off, for example, the upstream pillar, which is going to bankroll the growth pillar. Otherwise, you won't have either. You won't have the existing energy supply and will not have the ability to actually grow in the first place. And we will talk about this later, maybe in the Q&A, but importantly, it's business models and customer-facing solutions become really important in that realm. So it's not just about doing business as usual, but actually the way you conduct the business and deliver that business becomes really different. And I'll just leave you with that thought, and with the fact that in order to achieve net zero, the solutions must be broad, they must be deep, and they must be multi-pronged. There's no way to do it all with electrification, for example. So net zero transition doesn't equal electrification. It's enabled a lot by electrification, but they're not, not just electrification. You need also natural sinks. Carbon capture and sequestration is a big deal. I think we'll hear about that later. Electric mobility is a big part of it, biofuels, and of course, renewable power, but also operational efficiency in the existing asset base is critical too. And that, all together, that might get us close to the aspired net zero transition. But finally, I like to point out that I think if we take Hawaii as an inspiration, just its unique ecosystem, I think we need to think beyond net zero, actually. For the health of and the longevity of our planet, we need to think more about sustainability and circular economy as a whole. And what I mean by that, beyond, decarbonization and such, really think about the circular economy being, that in general, we need to use a lot fewer materials and less energy to do what we need to do. So for example, if our products can be easily repaired or self-repairing rather than discarded, then that will go a long way in order to achieve true sustainability. So for instance, batteries and recycling of the rare earth materials needed for an electrified economy needs to be front and center in our thinking too. And then another component is the fact that if you invoke all the challenges of supply chain, of again rare earth minerals and the scarcity, then the increased cost of newly built infrastructure must be factored in our thinking. And so we have to be a lot more clever in our designs, a lot less wasteful, and also the shortage of labor will require us to think a lot more about life extension and reuse than we traditionally have in previous industrial revolutions. So design for longevity, for shareability, for repair, for servicing and reuse is really something we need to think more about. And I'll stop here and thank you all in advance for your attention and look forward to the questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Hani. Yeah, thank you. Really appreciate it. So we'll circle back with the questions later. So the last presenter, last but not least, Dr. Timothy Meckel. Just background about Tim as an introduction. Dr. Meckel is a senior research scientist investigating geology carbon storage for the Bureau of Economic Geology at the University of Texas at Austin. During 15 years with the Gulf Coast Carbon Center at the Bureau, he has been directly involved with many large-scale field demonstration projects funded through the U.S. Department of Energy. Since 2008, he has been the principal investigator or co-PI on 16 CCS grants totaling over $70 million, focusing on offshore Gulf of Mexico. TIP has contributed to the recent CCUS study by the National Petroleum Council that was provided to the U.S. Energy Secretary in late 2019. He has also contributed to the effort of the Society of Petroleum Engineers for defining CO2 storage capacity compatible with SEC compliances. Thank you so much for Tip for joining us. We would love to hear your expertise in the area of CCS, CCUS, and maybe a couple of examples would be wonderful.
Sure. Well, thank you, Vinod, for the introduction, and thanks for the opportunity to talk about a topic I've worked on for quite a while now. Carbon capture and storage is a topic that's been around for quite some time. It's been researched for over 2 decades, but it's obviously seeing a resurgence of interest now, and we can talk a little bit about that in the course of our discussion here. I thought I'd go through a little bit of the basics and then deviate a little toward the end and show you some things that might help you understand what we're really trying to do in the subsurface when we're talking about storing CO2. So very similar to the last slide that Hani was just showing, actually, is a different way of looking at the same information, which is essentially thinking about where we are going to get large-scale emission reductions going out into the future. And so this is one version of that kind of information that was seen earlier, and it also sort of hints at what areas might be playing different roles in that reduction. So if the black line is sort of what we've been doing up until now, and then point forward, we're thinking about these different wedges that can be used to reduce emissions through time to ultimately achieve that reduction that's on that light blue curve there going forward at kind of hugging the bottom of those colors. So you'll see that there's about a third of that reduction coming from efficiency of different processes that are out there, maybe another third coming from renewable energy, and then the final third would be coming from a mixture of things like carbon capture and storage, which I work on, or switching fuels, say from coal to natural gas, or from natural gas to renewables, et cetera. So the important point for me in this discussion is that none of these is meant to solve the entire problem. It has to be a mixture, as you were just hearing. And so it's normal to think of carbon capture and storage as representing maybe 10 or 15% of the total emissions reductions we can expect going forward. So it's not meant to be a permanent solution. It's meant to be a bridge into a different future, say by 2050. And the point is that every molecule of CO2 that gets emitted today stays in the atmosphere for something like 200 years. So anything we can do to reduce that number of molecules that are entering the atmosphere today is a great benefit going forward. So that's really the aim of carbon capture and storage, is to reduce those industrial emissions that exist today and to address any of the new ones that may come forward in the future. So if you're not familiar with it, carbon capture and storage, sometimes referred to as carbon capture utilization and storage, is a rapidly evolving business, but it really is populated by 4 main sectors, and those are shown in the diagram towards the bottom. So you have different sources of CO2 emissions that are out there. These could be electric utilities, these could be natural gas processing facilities, they could be cement, steel, basically anything that's requiring power and or using different types of natural resources ends up emitting some CO2 in the process. So these are emissions that are quantified and reported to the US EPA, and so we have a very good idea of what the profile of these emissions look like through time. Currently, there's no, there's no legislation to cap the amount of emissions. So we have other incentives for trying to reduce these emissions that we can talk about at the end. But essentially, in that second image, you see that there's got to be some kind of capture equipment installed. So you need to actually install some new bit of engineering to capture the emission streams that's coming off of those different sources. And so not all CO2 emissions are created equal, and so some emissions are cheaper to capture than others. But we have very good technologies for capturing emissions from most of our most common emission sources. The cheapest would be, say, the emissions coming off of, say, an ethanol plant where you're converting corn into ethanol. And then from there, you might be moving into natural gas processing and further up into hydrogen production. And then lastly, the hardest things to decarbonize would be the production of cement and steel. So those two industries actually almost require CCS to decarbonize in order to contribute to low carbon goals. And in the case of capture, you transport the CO2. In this case, you're usually compressing it and moving it by pipeline. That's the most efficient way to move it. There are now ships being designed to move CO2 in the marine environment, and that is a rapidly evolving field as the CO2 starts to become more of a globally traded and shipped product. And then lastly there you see the CO2 sink, which is essentially the part that I work the most on, which is what do you do when you actually need to get rid of the CO2? We don't want it in the atmosphere, so we'd like to stick it into the deep subsurface geologic environments. And in a lot of ways, this is really a natural way to think about it, because a lot of the carbon that is produced in carbon dioxide is actually carbon that was coming out of the earth in some form of hydrocarbon originally. So returning it to the subsurface is a natural way to think about it. In some cases, you can use the CO2 in the utilization component to enhance oil recovery if that's part of an economic plan. But in the majority of the cases, the volume of CO2 and mass of CO2 that we're thinking about is actually needs to be injected into what we call saline formations. And these are rock bodies in the subsurface that basically contain pore water that is more saline than say ocean water. If you're having a hard time imagining how you get CO2 to go into rocks, the first thing to imagine is that we got the oil and gas out of the rocks in the first place. So there is space in the rocks by which we refer to it as porosity, and we can actually push the CO2 back into the rocks the same way we produced hydrocarbons out. And the obvious way to think about that is just your sponge. You can actually put water into your sponge even though it looks nominally like a solid. Okay, so one thing to point out is that globally this topic is actually ramping up quite fast, and in the North Sea part of Europe and the EU, we see a lot of active projects developing. Most of these are taking advantage of offshore storage, where the CO2 is being transported into the offshore environment, where it's then injected deep into the subsurface. And by deep, I mean at least a mile or say 1,500 meters beneath the seafloor. So deep into the subsurface, not the sediments or the water column. And here you're just seeing different paths of potential transport of CO2 from the emission sources to the most likely emission sinks where you would actually be storing the CO2. So we know that Norway has been doing this since 1996 in the North Sea, where they've been capturing CO2 from a gas processing facility and re-injecting it successfully in the North Sea. And they have a second project in the northern part of the country that's also working along, and now we know that there are projects being developed in the Netherlands as well as in the UK. So this is active developments in that part of the world. I was lucky enough to be able to go over and work on a project where they're actively injecting CO2 offshore off the energy port in the North Island of Hokkaido. So this is a project where they were essentially testing their ability to capture emissions from a gas processing facility, and then inject that CO2 using a well that actually has a surface location essentially on the beach there at that red dot. But the bottom hole location is actually in the offshore environment in the deep subsurface. So it's a long deviated well to reach the injection point. And so we were able to go over and use some technology that DOE had funded us to work on to monitor the injection site to make sure that the CO2 is staying in the intended injection interval. And the project was highly successful and is now concluded. In the United States, if you think about emissions, the inset map in the upper left kind of shows sort of where most of our emissions are in the United States. They're dominantly in the upper Midwest and the Ohio River Valley, and then along the Gulf Coast. And the emissions in the upper Midwest are largely related to either ethanol production or power production, not entirely, but dominantly. And then in the Gulf Coast, we see a lot of emissions related to a diverse industrial processes. Everything that is in your kitchen is probably derived from something that was produced in one of these places. So we think a lot about these emissions and how we might be able to basically address these historic emissions to ongoing emissions, I should call them, to reduce them so that they're not emitted to the atmosphere. One of the things that makes the most sense in the Gulf Coast is to consider offshore storage like they are in the North Sea. And that means you're basically going to be transporting the CO2 into the offshore environment, much like we bring hydrocarbons from the offshore environment onshore today, just reversing the process and essentially going back out and reinjecting CO2 into the deep offshore. In the case of Texas, if you work in the state offshore lands, the first 10 miles offshore, then the royalties and revenues of those activities actually end up going into the permanent school fund and used for primary education throughout the state. So there's actually a huge circular benefit to working on CCS in the state lands, at least in Texas. And then lastly, I just want to give you a sense of what we mean by deep subsurface. And if you don't know geology, here we're looking at sort of a profile from the onshore to the left into say the marine basin on the right. And this is just an animation showing how sediments accumulate through time in that area. And these different colors just represent different types of materials that would be deposited through time. And we might be witnessing about a 30 million year time period here with relative sea level changing and the different sediments being accumulated. And so when we're thinking about our injections in the deep subsurface, you can see that the geology can be quite complex, but it can also be exceedingly thick. So this, if we were to think about the far left side now being the coast of Texas, then we know that in that near offshore environment, we could start to encounter thousands and even tens of thousands of feet of accumulated sediments. And so our goal as geologists is to go in here and find the correct environments in which we can store the CO2. And then lastly, I just want to show you oh, by the way, this is highly vertically exaggerated. The horizontal distance might be even 50 or 100 miles, whereas the vertical distance might only be, say, 2 or 3 miles. So highly vertically exaggerated. And then lastly, I just want to show you some examples of how CO2 moves through rocks. So this is actually just laboratory experiments, and these sand tanks are about a couple meters long, so maybe about my height in horizontal length, and then about 500 centimeters high. And so we were just conducting experiments to basically visualize the flow of CO2 through rock material. So if you're wondering, like, how do you get CO2 into rocks? Well, this is kind of what it looks like. The upper image is homogeneous, meaning it's fairly consistent quality sand, and the bottom one will be heterogeneous materials that have lots of different, say, grain sizes within that sand. And so as you animate it, you'll see CO2 moving upwards. It's buoyant. It tends to want to move vertically, just like oil and gas do. And so you can see it kind of forms this plume around, say, an injection point, and then retains some saturation as some of it migrates off to the left. And then in the more complex geology, which is actually much more realistic of the subsurface, you'll see that the CO2 moves through the material in a much more patchy way, and actually you can start to retain quite a bit of CO2 in this material as it migrates along. And so ultimately, this is what we think of when we think of storage, is CO2 moving through the rock body and then essentially being retained there in the subsurface for time scales that we care about. So that's what I had for you today. I'd just like to thank some of our groups, the sponsors of our center at the University of Texas at Austin, the U.S. Department of Energy, and then our Texas General Land Office, as well as some of our data providers. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Kip, for that presentation. I really like those animations. It was really helpful. And maybe we can, the panel members can, yeah, I think they're back. Elena, if you turn your camera on. So I have a couple of questions. Maybe I can start. And audience, if you have any questions, please, put those things in the Q&A or the chat so we can follow up on those questions. I wanted to open up with I think it seems like the panel members together, you go like several decades of experience in dealing with the energy industry. I was just curious, what are your predictions or your best guess whether we can decarbonize the economy in the next 30 years? And what's your best guess? Maybe you start with Elena, and then feel free to discuss among the panel members too. So maybe we'll just start with Elena.
So I'm not very optimistic with respect to the pace of change, just because it's so complicated. And I thought Hani's presentation was excellent in trying to identify the complexity. And then I thought, Tip's presentation was excellent with respect to one particular facet. That's pretty complicated as well. So, I guess the reality of it is when we make plans that require a lot of time, we don't really have a unified thought about how we're going to get there. And you have to have a really clean and robust plan and be able to have the resources to make changes, because we don't really know how it's all going to work out. We have good estimates, we can do modeling, we can do some prediction, we can kind of frame it carefully, but you don't know till you get there what's going to happen. So it's really about that lasting commitment to pursue it. And I don't know that we have enough of an interest. There's a global interest, of course, in the climate change, but that's such a big challenge to actually put a number on when we're going to be there and when we're going to finish. I think is really not realistic. But that doesn't mean we should not chip away at it. Just as I showed the example of becoming independent of outside sources of oil and gas, that was 42 years, and people knew there was money in it. It just took time, but you needed to get to the technology space and the willingness and the interest to pursue it. So yeah, I'm not optimistic. Doesn't mean we shouldn't try. I'm just saying, I don't know.
Thank you, Elena. Hani or Kip, you want to comment on it?
Yeah,
I mean, yeah, please go ahead.
I was just going to say, from what I've seen, there's usually a difference between sort of a will or an intent and an ability. And for what I see in carbon capture and storage, the ability is highly tied to the economics of being feasibility of being able to do something. So in the case I was mentioning briefly in Norway, they re-inject CO2 into the subsurface because Norway has an emissions tax that's been in place for quite some time. So it was actually more expensive for them to emit CO2 than it was to re-inject it into the subsurface. And different countries will pursue different ways to incentivize the reduction in emissions in all sectors. In the United States, for the emissions that are related to power and industrial sectors, we have a federal tax credit that's been in place for over 10 years that is helping companies make decisions to go forward and capture CO2, but their intent is entirely tied to their financial ability to do so. And so without that incentive in place, then be very little action until there's actually a mandate on emissions, which we actually tried back in 2009 when we had the Waxman-Markey bill, very close to passing, but it didn't. And in the interim, we basically used a tax incentive program that was very popular in solar and wind, and we've moved it over into carbon capture now. So we think that there's probably going to be a lot of movement in this, but I think folks that are trying to understand, the nuts and bolts of what it actually takes to reduce emissions, it does cost more money, and there is going to be that cost will be passed on to consumers.
Yeah, not a whole lot to add there. Completely agree with comments from Elena and Tip. I mean, I'll just sum it up as just like a lot of things, there's really no free lunch. There will be a cost and there will be some pain, and eventually it'll come to the consumer. But what's different, I guess, this time about decades past, since Kyoto, and for instance, is that certainly the will is there. Sort of the global consensus seems to be there. That does not make necessarily the task much, any easier. It just means we're on the way to do that. But I think, need to temper the expectations a little bit. I particularly get concerned when there's a lot of, putting too much emphasis on numeric, exchanges of, pledges here and pledges there, because predicting the future is a pretty difficult thing to do. You can predict directionally where it's going, but with precision, it's going to be very hard to do. So.
And if I might add, with respect to the pain that might, be required in order to make a change, I think people are to a certain extent willing to pursue some of it, but that's where it will take a long time because there's only so much you can do in a certain amount of time. So I think at a minimum, we've got wonderful awareness, global awareness. And of course, that's the first step. But I agree that with respect to trying to put hard and fast timelines, that's a challenge. That's unrealistic, and you lose credibility, and that undermines the motivation to continue to move forward for the long term. That's it. Thank you.
No, thank you. Well, thank you, Elena, and thank you, Hani and Tip. Tip, I wanted to revisit one of the things that you demonstrated. You said the CCS efforts in Japan. That was interesting, and because it's a Hawaii Book and Film Festival, I thought maybe I should ask this question: what is the potential of CCS in a place like Hawaii?
Yeah, I think it's really very unlikely that a state like Hawaii will pursue CCS in any fashion. They'll probably do much better to transition from an emitting energy source to a renewable source. That said, I do know some solar developers in the state who, are interested in that. But really on the capture and storage side, it's actually more related to geology. The geology there is just not as suitable. It's not what I was showing you there in that interesting progression of sedimentation. The Hawaiian margin is far different. It's very unique, as we all know. So no, I don't think we'll be doing it there. It's actually kind of unlikely we'll be doing it in Japan. I think they're more likely to be importing things like hydrogen and ammonia in the long term, and leaving the CO2 back where the primary energy was produced in the first place. So that's what we're seeing right now anyway. So I wouldn't be surprised if Hawaii imports hydrogen or ammonia similarly.
I have a quick last question. Who wants to take it? This is from the audience. I couldn't skip it. The share of renewable energy used in the process of Bitcoin mining is now over 50%. This is because Bitcoin mining profitability is solely dependent on the marginal cost of energy, which naturally selects for renewables. Would this or a similar model of decentralized asset distribution based on renewable energy creation is useful in catalyzing a space race towards decarbonization? Quick answers, please. Who wants
Quick
to
answer
take
is
the
yes.
relationship between?
Quick answer is yes, because I do think decentralization of the and disaggregation of the energy mix is a real thing, both in terms of the generation as well as the distribution. In fact, if you really look, net zero transitions will be very local in character, because the requirements of each place are quite different. So, for example, you have a lot of sunshine in some places, you have a lot of wind in some places, you hardly have the combination in except a few places, and then you may not have the geology to do CCS in those very same places. So it will be almost by definition more disaggregated than we conventionally have done with traditional energy systems. So
thank you.
I'm actually way more interested. I'm way more interested in the opportunity to use the technology, blockchain technology that underlies currencies like Bitcoin and the others to document permanent carbon reductions. I think that's a far more interesting topic, in my opinion.
that's true.
Thank you, Ted. With that, I want to thank the panel members, and I want to hand it over to Roger. I see Roger online.
Yes. Well, thank you very much. That was incredibly informative, very rich, and we learned a great deal. Thank you, panel.
Thank you very much.
Really impressive.
Thank you.
And thank you, Vino, for
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Aloha.
I know that Elena and everybody is at about 10:30, 11:30 time frame now. Actually past midnight now. So thank you so much. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.